It's time now for perspective. Defenders of the capitalist system argue that it's conducive to creating wealth, encouraging innovation, and promoting individual freedoms, while advocates for socialism counter that it not only reduces inequality, but also improves access to basic rights, including health and education. But what about the effect of either of those systems on women's sex lives? In her book, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism and Other Arguments for Economic Independence, Professor Kristen Ghodsee concludes that socialist policies are more economically and sexually beneficial to women. She joins me now on set. Thank you so much for coming, Kristen.
Thanks so much for having me.
I want to start by asking you, for those of our viewers who haven't yet read your book, can you talk about the choice of adopting a kind of ethnographical approach as opposed to the purely historical, economic, or even philosophical approach that's often used to tackle these types of subjects?
Right. Well, I'm a social scientist, and so I'm really interested in actual empirical data rather than just sort of historical, investigations or theoretical, philosophical kinds of thinking about these questions. And so when you look at the question of whether or not an economic system is good or bad for women or a specific group of people, what you want to do is find a natural experiment. And it turns out that the reunification of Germany in 1990, after 45 years of communism, is the perfect natural experiment because you have two groups of people that grew up. They're similar culturally, they're similar linguistically, they're similar historically. The only thing that has divided them is 45 years of their economic system. And so for me, I really wanted to look at the empirical evidence, the actual data, the studies that were done talking about the effects of capitalism versus communism on people's private lives.
And what about the capitalist system makes capitalism harmful to women in particular?
So very specifically, it's this concept of statistical discrimination, which basically means that since employers in a free market economy don't have perfect information about their employees, they use statistical averages to determine whether or not a particular employee is going to be productive or not. And so since women generally have care responsibilities in the home for children, for elderly relatives, sometimes for sick relatives, that means that women are less reliable workers. And since women are less reliable as a class in general, employers, the only reason they have to hire them is if they can pay them less. So that's why women are generally cheaper than men. That's why there's a wage gap. Well, under capitalism, this problem creates a vicious cycle because when a heterosexual couple decides to have children, or if there's an elderly relative that needs to be looked after for some reason and there's no support from the society to do that, one of the two partners has to stay home. Well, the economically rational decision, of course, is for the partner with the lower wage to stay home. And since that's usually the woman, that reinforces the stereotype that women are less reliable workers, which then further reinforces the idea that women should be paid less. So that's a vicious cycle that markets cannot solve, right? So because of the way that statistical discrimination works, women are always going to be at a disadvantage on the labor market under capitalism.
Okay, and I have to ask, as the clever and catchy title of your book suggests, capitalism affects, of course, not only all of the things that you just described, but also women's sex lives. What is the relationship that you found there?
So the relationship is a very clear one. In a society where women have fewer opportunities outside of the home for education, for work, they have to choose their romantic partners often on the basis of whether or not, this is of course, again, in a heterosexual relationship, whether or not he's a good provider, whether he can pay the bills, whether or not he can pay for groceries and take care of the children. And so she's not necessarily choosing her partner on the basis of love or attraction or mutual affection. She's choosing her partner on the basis of whether or not he's going to be a good provider. In some societies, it's actually her parents, perhaps, who chooses the partner. He could be old, he could be ugly, he could be unattractive to her in many ways. So the obverse of that is that in a society where women have lots of economic opportunities and are generally supported by a broad social safety net, she doesn't need to choose a partner on the basis of whether or not he can pay for dinner or the rent or the bills, but she can choose a partner on the basis of affection. And more importantly, what it means is that in a society where women have economic independence, if her partner is abusive, if her partner is not treating her well or not treating her child well, in a psychological way, or if she's just generally dissatisfied with that relationship, the risk of leaving that relationship is much lower from an economic point of view. And so again, she's going to be in a relationship with somebody that she wants to be with, not that she has to be with for economic reasons. And so therefore, we have some good empirical evidence that it turns out that when women get to choose their partners because they like them, because they're attractive and they're funny, that they tend to enjoy their sexual relations with those people much better than when they're being forced to exchange their affective resources, as I call them in the book, for money.
Okay, I want to touch upon something that you mentioned in your prior response. You concede in your book that in no country were women's rights promoted as a project, exclusively as a project to support individualism or women's self-actualization. Instead, the state supported women as workers and mothers so that they could participate more fully in the workforce. So it begs the question, is women's integration to the workforce the best measure of emancipation? Can't that also easily become a form of oppression in a sense when a woman's freedom is judged solely on her capacity to work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really clear, as I say in the book, that I'm not talking about these societies as paradises, right? There were lots of problems. And their primary motivation, especially when they instituted these policies, was like in the United States after the Second World War. They needed women in the labor force because either the men were off fighting at the front or they had died in a war. In the case of the Soviet Union, it was the Civil War, first World War and then the Civil War, and then in the case of Eastern Europe, it was the Second World War. So it's important that there are often ulterior motives. However, I think I want to make a big distinction here, and this is really important, between a kind of liberal girl boss feminism, whereby women are empowered by becoming CEOs or becoming politicians and making a lot of money so that they can turn around and pay poorer women to look after their children. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about that kind of emancipation. I think liberal feminism has given us that kind of emancipation for the last 40 years, and the pandemic showed that when schools closed and when hospitals were closing, senior homes were closing, the work went home, women left their jobs, nothing had really changed. What I'm talking about is creating broader social safety nets. And so what happens in societies where women are working and where there's a respect not only for women, but also a real valuing of bringing up the next generation, that broader social safety net not only supports women, it also supports men. It also helps men because they don't have all this pressure to be providers, right? We have very good statistical surveys that show that at least in the United States and the United Kingdom, the idea of a good partner, of a good husband, is related to whether or not he can pay the bills, whether he's a provider. So yeah, it's not just about women working. It's about creating a society that allows everybody to be less precarious. And for women, that means getting outside the home and actually contributing to society in a broader way, not necessarily just economically, but having the freedom to work outside of the private sphere.
Okay, and as a last question, Kristen, quickly to tail end off of that, do you think that capitalism is irredeemable?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think I'm gonna. Yes, sometimes yes. I actually, I can, because we don't have a lot of time, that's a very nuanced question, but I think that on this particular issue, when it comes to women's rights, but we can also talk about things like climate change. We can also talk about automation. We can also talk about extreme inequality. To the extent that capitalism means free markets and private property, those big problems that we face in the 21st century are not going to be solved by the free market. So to the extent that capitalism means some kind of like profit motive that makes everybody work for their self-interest, that's going to exacerbate inequality. It's going to make climate change worse. It's also going to create lots of problems with automation down the road. And I argue, and most importantly from my perspective, it's going to exacerbate sexism and the gender pay gap between men and women.
Well, Kristen, on that, this is something that I could go on for hours really talking about. Thank you so much to our viewers. Kristen Ghodsee, author of Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Well, that ends this edition, but do stay tuned for France 24. More news is coming up soon.